Take this. Now I gotta turn my back.
$3,200. That's what he gave me. $3,200 for a lifetime.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes. It's been a bit of an interesting time here in the comic book industry. Feels like with some of DC's recent changes, their biggest competition as far as hardcore comic book fans is no longer going to be, it's not really manga. The people that were ready to leave have kind of already moved over to manga. It's not, YA graphic novel. Obviously, some people go over there. But I think DC and Marvel's biggest competition is going to be themselves, and not themselves in the moment, but themselves 20 years ago, 30 years ago, because one of the wonderful things about comic books is there's an 80-year history. Likely, no comic book fan in the world has actually read them all. And a lot of those comic books are still around, or they're being collected in trades. Now, I do have a good friend. He's been reading comic books, I think as long as I've been alive. He's a wonderful man. He's a great human being, and he loves comic books. And he's got some keen insight on this one. The man so cool, they call him the Breen, the comic book hoarder. Eric Breen, how you doing?
Doing pretty well.
Well, I'm glad you could make it today, buddy. We're like, what should we talk about? I don't want to talk about the new stuff. It's gonna, I'm a little bit irritated right now. But you were talking about how much fun you were having. If people do not know this, you had some time on your hands, and I guess your local comic shop needed some help, and you've been offering some time. I imagine you're being compensated in some form, but really, you're the one that's making out with all the bonuses here, right, buddy?
I'm putting together a sale for the comic shop that I've been going to for 40 years, and it was literally a truckload of comics, and I'm going through them.
When you say a truckload, are we talking, a Chevy Silverado? Are we talking a semi?
What they call a cube van, 75 long boxes. And some stragglers off to the side. So, and I've been going through them and picking out what's going to go into a tent sale that we're going to have, a dollar tent sale, and what is better than that. But the hardest thing about this has been, I'm looking at it as these are all worth more than $1 out of it, but then the business side of me goes, no, they're not. And I am putting.
All right, Eric. I want you to be honest with the viewers, because I know you. You have found a home for many of these comic books, and it's not in the tent sale.
No, I have found a home for a few hundred of them.
So far.
I'm done. I'm now in the second half of it. But what I've been putting hundreds, if not thousands, of books that I read and have collected and loved into this dollar sale, because in 2021, that's all they're basically worth. And I'm talking about DC events, all the stuff that led up to Infinite Crisis, which was so sprawling in scope when you map it all out. All the side series, like one of the Rand Thanagar Wars, the OMAC Project, and way more. If I'd had more than a second to think about this, I could rattle off. Then following that, you had 52, then Countdown, which I know isn't well received, but there were a lot of side series involved in that. Then into Blackest Night and Brightest Day, and there were so many just really, really great storylines. And going through a lot of the books, like the Green Lantern titles, the Batman titles, and there's so many great stories, and they had so much talent working on this book. And that's to say nothing of what was going on over at Marvel, everything from House of M through Siege, Dark Reign, Secret Invasion. And the talent working on Marvel comics was just incredible in those days as well.
So these are the comics. They're not really old enough to be scarce, because they're high print runs, but they're not old enough to where over time they've attrited out, and you have a pretty limited number of comics available. So monetarily wise, they're not extremely scarce or rare or therefore valuable. But quality wise, they far surpass anything, because I've been trying to get Eric to talk to me about something about current comic books, and he's got nothing, because I cannot divert his attention away from all of these old comic books. It's all you talk about, Eric.
Well, and it says that's not that long ago. When you think about it, I mean,
Exactly.
it's 10 to 15 years ago. And DC before that, through the 90s, I thought had a ton of really, really good events. Final Night, Judgment Day, Zero Hour. Now there were individual books in these events that maybe weren't so great, but there's it's fun to go back and put all the issues together of some of their events, like Final Night, for example, was basically the sun was being extinguished and the earth was just continuing to get colder and colder. And you would read one of those books and you kind of felt like you were getting cold yourself reading because you could fully immerse yourself in that story. It's kind of like Cataclysm, prior to No Man's Land. Those books were so good, you felt like you had been in that earthquake. And just when you get all the stories put together and you can read an event from beginning to end, back when the side issues were important. I mean, they weren't totally necessary, but you wanted to read the side issues. Now it just seems like they throw them out there as literally nothing more than cash grabs.
They
And they're
feel
not,
like a burden.
yeah. Whereas in my day, so to speak, you wanted to read all the connecting stories.
It's crazy, Eric. So, obviously we talk weekly here on the channel just about comic books and stuff like that. And we had a nice time talking about some history and whatever. But I've noticed your mood is just as far as comic books. Kind of before, just think about the new comics. There was hope there, but it was slowly being extinguished. But ever since you got on this project, like I feel like you're reinvigorated about comic books as you're getting back into this old stuff. How are DC or Marvel going to dig you out of these boxes?
um, Honestly, I've actually really been passionate about this hobby again for years. And it's weird. I said, I've never enjoyed the hobby more. And this is after I sold a 55,000 book collection and don't really have any great affinity for what's being published today from the big two. But that's where the 80 plus years of comic history comes into play. If you are a lifer, as I am, it you don't need what's coming out next week to appreciate the hobby because there's all those decades to draw from. Now, when something happens in the new comic industry that catches my eye, I'm there for. I mean, I read every issue of Endless Winter. I think that was the last event that I participated in, and I read Generation Shattered, but I still haven't read Generation Forged. I've got it sitting here, and I'll get back to it. But I said that when there's so much to go back to, because I think that's the difference between being a collector or a historian or however you want to look at it versus someone who's just a comic reader of the moment. Because if you're just into it for what's coming out next week, if it disappoints you, you may just leave altogether. Whereas somebody like me can just retreat back into the past until the present, makes it something that I want to be a part of again.
Yeah, they have to earn your time and your awareness and to go out there and buy new comics. So now I imagine, in the moment, maybe when you were a younger man, 30, 20, something like that, maybe there was an adventure you read here or there that you thought wasn't so great. But now with hindsight being 2020 and reading maybe some of the modern stuff, is there anything that you're going back and you're seeing, you're like, hey, now that I think about it, this is pretty good. I'm glad I get to get reminded of this story or this event, because now that I think about it, I really want to own this now.
Maybe not an individual event, although I'll probably come up with something while I'm talking about this. I think when you start reading, whenever that is, you're kind of protective of the era that you started, especially if it's something that's led to a lifelong hobby. Where my case was the mid 70s. So I read the books that were coming out at that time. And for Marvel, there was only 15 years to go back to, in my case. So I'd read the 60s stuff and into the 70s. And then as the 80s unfolded, it was like, with the exception of the seminal runs of Simonson, Miller, Byrne, and Claremont, yeah, the rank and file books, I don't know. It just doesn't measure up to, in my day, which in that case was only a decade before. But now I'm going back and revisiting a lot of books from the 80s, and I realize they have aged incredibly well. I can even find some good in Atlantis Attacks or the Evolutionary War, because the storytelling was, in my opinion, just seemed to be better than, by and large, than it is now, even though the writers have way more modern techniques that they can use that should make them better. And I'm sure to some people, the newer stuff is structurally much better and unfolds much better. But for me, I'm more interested in how an event fit the comic book universe and where it fit what came before and how it affected what came after. Whereas nowadays it seems like an event is just of the moment, and will anything that happens in Empire matter a year from now? Even something like King in Black, which I understand is very well received, will that have any long-term effects in anything other than future projects that Donny Cates does?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and we're in the Omniverse, where DC Comics has told us everything matters, therefore nothing matters. So if you are into continuity, and as I imagine as a lifelong reader, one of the attractions to a lineup of Marvel Comics or DC Comics and sticking with them, not only is the wonderful characters, the superhero stories, the moments of heroism, but it is that shared continuity, that connective tissue that brings all these characters together, which seems to be kind of being thrown out the window right now. But if you're really into that, hey, listen, you don't have to get frustrated by that too. You can just go back 20 years and get a fully connected universe for the most part.
Yeah, that's it. The new Omniverse, this idea that everything that happened before did happen does matter. But I think it's also an excuse to ignore everything that happened before.
Yes.
And
ignore anything that you don't want to have complicate your story.
Yeah, and that might benefit some titles, but it also just will give modern writers a chance to put modern spin and modern sensibilities on characters and write them totally different than they'd been established throughout the years. And that's maybe not necessarily a bad thing for all, but it's not something that really attracts me to a newer title when something like that is done.
So does it feel freeing or refreshing now that you don't have to get a little bit frustrated maybe with the current offerings, and you're like, you know what, fuck it, I have a home right here, in these comic books that I'm rediscovering. And I'm sure there are moments in your life when you look at a certain story and be like, that was a good part of my life. This reminds me of something really good. To kind of, nostalgia also helps that way too, where it kind of reminds you of some of the good stuff that happened.
Absolutely. I pick up a comic from, say, 1976, and I'm 14 years old again. I'm listening to that first official Warren Zevon or Eagles Hotel California. I remember I can remember where I was when I got them. I can even remember riding home on my bike and the condensation from the Mountain Dew bottle water damaged my Defenders annual #1. I mean, all those memories come back, and they're great little time capsules. And and sometimes if you go back to like your beginnings, the stories themselves may not necessarily be anything that was great long term, but they're great to me because it just brings back all those memories. And so you've got that plus the stories that really were good. I mean, there was a 5-part. I mean, when I first started the first issue of Fantastic Four I ever read was a thing Hulk team up to fight the other Fantastic Four members because Ben thought that his fellow monster was being mistreated. Then the gamma radiation cured him of being the Thing. Power Man takes his place in the team. Ben gets pissed. And they go right from that to a 5-part Galactus story on Counter Earth. I mean, just one cool story after another. And there was so much of that. And I know part of it again is me looking at it through the lens of a child, which or a teenager as I was at the time. But those stories will always have a special meaning. And I can find the same thing about books from the 80s, the 90s, and into that first decade of the 2000s. But there's the number of stories that I can look at from the past 10 years with any reverence, short of the Tomasi Jurgens Superman, are few and far between.
Yeah, there's some good stuff that I think is going to stand the test of time. I think Batman White Knight, I think Doomsday Clock, the end of Chip Zdarsky's Peter Parker Spectacular Spider-Man. There's some cool stuff in there, probably Hawks and Pox, maybe, depending where it goes in the future. But so obviously you're thinking about or retrospecting about through the lens of somebody that's been reading comic books for such a long time. I imagine there's some people that are frustrated right now. I have not been reading comics nearly as long as you, but I do find when I go back and I'm able to read some of the classics, the classics for the most part are classic for a reason because they are exciting stories. Obviously, you're talking about maybe not diving into all the classics, just kind of taking it all in. Do you think some of the younger readers, if they go down and check out the dollar bin and just grab 3 sequential Fantastic Fours that are in there that maybe aren't highly thought of or on the list as part of a big reading order, like, do you think it's going to be worth their time, or do you think you had to be in the moment to come back and enjoy it?
No, it depends on what you're looking for in a comic book. If you read comics today for the modern social sensibilities and you want your comics to feel like they could be happening in the real world, as a lot of writers are attempting to do, then I'm not sure you're going to get anything out of books even 15 years old, because they were still just telling stories, for the sake of adventure. And a lot of modern comics have drifted away from that into more what they call social relevance, which was tried in the past. I mean, as far back as Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams' Green Lantern, Green Arrow, and those seem kind of quaint by today's standards. But if you're just looking to, if you got into comics because you like these larger than life characters and you want to see Superman not drawn with a dad bod like he was in Leviathan, then yes, I recommend go haunt some dollar boxes. Every comic book store, hell, every Half Price Books has them, and just go through, find some books from the 80s, which is about as far back as you're going to find stuff in the dollar boxes now, and just pick out a couple. I say, if you see, oh, here's a Spider-Man, here's a Hulk, here's a Batman, here's a Superman, and see what they were like decades ago, and see if it's something that you want to do going forward, because they are cheaper than investing in a trade. And you might read the trade and go, oh, okay, this isn't really what I was wanting. And you might have spent $3 out of a dollar box versus 16 to 19 to even more sometimes on a trade. Yeah, I think the dollar boxes are a great introduction to new fans.
It's also way more bang for your buck with the modern storytelling. Like, every story is 5 to 6 issues minimum.
Yeah.
And depending on the writer, it might be 50 issues if it's Tom King. You got to get the whole story and got to read for 50. But back in the day, Chris Claremont, people like, he's the master of the long form storytelling on X-Men. Not really. Yeah, he told a long form story, but there was individual episodes in the middle with their own stories as that was going along. And in one issue of 22, 24 pages, you got a full story. And you don't get that anymore. So I think you get an entire episode's worth of entertainment in one comic book back then.
Yeah, and that's another thing when you have people that have just gotten into the hobby, when you try to convince them to go back and grab individual issues out of, say, a dollar bin or something, they're hesitant because they have been trained on the 6-issue arc to fit the trade. They go, well, if I just pick this one issue out, I'm not going to know what's going on because I might come in the middle of a 6-issue arc. Well, that wasn't the case 25, 30 years ago. There, you could read a full story in 2 parts. I always reference Days of Future Past.
Yeah.
2 issues. Yeah, I shudder to think what that would be today. I just read, now you're not going to find this in a dollar box, but the first KGB story, The 10 Nights of the Beast, which was Batman 417 through 420. Now that is 4 issues, but holy crap, I'd forgotten how great that was. Now, KG Beast has been reduced to little more than a joke now, but boy, he wasn't in this one. And it was the only time that Batman kind of willingly killed, because it ends with him walling him up basically in a tomb and leaving. So it's
something similar in Tom King's Batman. He left him to die, knowing that he was mortally wounded.
And if assuming King knows any history, he probably got that idea from issue 420. But there's like I said, there's so much great stuff out there, and fortunately, through trades, so as far as getting the individual issues, if you haven't won the Powerball recently, or you're not a trust fund kid, it's hard to break into the hobby because the price of back issues are so cost prohibitive. And I'm not just talking about what the speculators have done to it. I was talking about what time has done.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the great stories are available in affordable formats. Whether they're omnibuses, masterworks, epic collections, essentials. But yeah, there are a lot of ways to really reinvigorate or invigorate a love for the hobby. And you realize, and you can learn that how much great stuff there came before what you're reading now.
Yeah, with $6 Batman comics and just some of the stuff they're doing with the characters, and then continuity not mattering. They say it in DC. It feels like it's the same thing over there in Marvel. I think that, at this point, the hardcore fans are the hardcore fans that are going to stick around. But I think eventually DC and Marvel will end up losing out to their own, to themselves, but 30 years earlier. Because why go spend all this money for stories that you don't need when you could go a cheaper route, go to your dollar bin, or even go and get a nice back issue that you've been interested in, or an issue that meant something to you, and get something more worthwhile out of it. I think, back issues are going to probably is going to be the hottest comics as far as Western comics for a while.
Yeah, there are always going to be the people that have to know what comes next, and they will continue to buy the new stuff. But there's also a segment of the comic book collectors, or the collectors readers, which I do think is starting to divide into 2 groups. I think the people that are concentrating on the new stuff aren't going back as much as they would have once upon a time, because the books themselves are so different now than they were then. The characters some of them may look the same and have the same names, but you read a character like a Green Lantern, it's not the same. The Hal Jordan Green Lantern that you're reading today is a far cry from what he was 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago. They're just different. Now, they might be same enough to satisfy some, but others may just choose to pick a side, more or less. And as I said, we've talked about this before, that the industry doesn't seem to be doing a lot of work to bridge that gap. And they said, if you create, if your output doesn't appeal to anybody that isn't just reading the stuff that's out now, because they may go back and read back issues and go, I don't understand any of this stuff. Not because of the convoluted continuity, but my Green Lantern does this and that one does that, because the sensibilities of the industry have changed so much in the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm. So I'm glad to see that the fire has been reignited, You're giddy like a little schoolgirl about comic books again, Breen. I wish we could talk about modern comics, but I don't want to make you unhappy again. I'm glad that you found so many of these back issues and you're putting this big sale together because you're loving it, man, and I'm loving it for you.
Thanks.